Good morning to everyone, and once again, a very warm welcome to our Toolbox Talk Tuesday mornings. We'd like to say thank you very much to IOPSA, the Institute of Plumbing South Africa, as well as to SIOSH and to PRB for the incredible work that they are doing for the interest of health and safety in our industry. We want to extend a very big thank you to all of our attendees this morning. We want to also express our gratitude to you for the amazing feedback that we have received, as well as for all the questions and compliments that we have received over the past months and years. So today we are discussing risk assessments. We're looking forward to excavations next week. We'll be discussing hazardous environments, this time looking at working on a scaffold. And then at the end of the month, thanks to a very good man, Rudy Glock, thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. We are going to be looking at carbon monoxide, especially when it comes to gas geysers. Is this dangerous? What should we know? And how can we protect ourselves from it? So this morning, we look at risk assessments, and please, we are encouraging you to reach out as much as possible for any information that you would like to receive. Let's get straight into our toolbox talk for this morning. When we discuss risk assessments, and as we mentioned this morning, it's that time again. Why are we saying that? Well, it's that time to ensure that our monitor and review plan is not only effective, but it's really doing the right thing for our risk assessments. Now, let's first discuss what are we talking about. The risk assessment itself, you've seen it before. This is a document that outlines the identification of all hazards on site. It then tells us what the risks are that are associated with those hazards. For instance, if you're working at heights, this becomes a hazard. The risk of working at heights is falling, and the potential or likelihood or consequences of that fall vary depending on the height, what you are working on, whether it's a ladder, a rooftop, or a scaffold, and perhaps even how long you are working on that. All changes the nature of the risk. However, the risk itself of falling is still very much real. But why then are we talking about monitor and review when it comes to our risk assessments? Well, this is because government legislation has told us that we have to implement a monitor and review program, a proper plan to understand whether our risk assessment is effective in mitigating the hazards. So let's discuss this. For this week, or perhaps even throughout the month, we might be getting ready for next year. A lot of us are taking a look at our management systems, our health and safety plans, our health and safety policies, and we are starting to take a look at what happened in the year past, what has happened up to now that we need to change, and where are we moving forward to the future. And this is a very good thing to do specifically with our risk assessments. The first thing we want to do is monitor. Now, this is an ongoing process. Monitoring basically means to observe and check the progress of quality of something over a period of time and keeping it under systematic review. And review means to assess something formally with the intention of instituting change if necessary. Now, we say if necessary because it's not always needed to change something, but there are certain times where we do need to change something in our risk assessment. Let's take a look at what we are actually checking, monitoring, or reviewing. So risk assessment is the very first part of something that we want to discuss. Now, each one of you are expected basically to understand what the risk assessment is, whether you're an employer or an employee. Out in the industry, specifically when doing any sort of plumbing works, you are going to come across certain hazards and certain risks. And the risk assessment goes along with your health and safety file. But is it the same risk assessment that you've been working with for many years? Perhaps you received the templates from us and you're still using those same templates. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. The outline and the methodology of how you go about identifying your hazard and assessing your risk, that just needs to be checked. Normally, we just take a look at what is industry standard Are there any better methods of doing it? And what can we do to improve the way we do risk assessments? What we can do there is go for continual training. Maybe something has changed in the idea or the way we do something. So when it comes to risk assessment, we always want to keep ourselves updated with the latest ways of identifying risk and also rating our risk appropriate to the scope of work that we are performing. But there are three types of risk assessments, and we've chatted about this before. Your initial, your baseline risk assessment. This is really an overview of a company's major risk categories. And what this baseline risk does is it helps us to specifically view all the major risks and to prioritize those risks. So we go from catastrophic, high, medium, low, and obviously insignificant, depending on the type of risk assessment you have. You could just have high, medium, and low. Now, this really doesn't matter how you're running your risk assessment. All that matters is it effective? And the monitor and review plan helps us to know this. And we're going to explain to you how that works in a minute. The second type of risk assessment that we are looking at is your task or issue-based risk assessment. And this risk assessment is carried out for each specific task or issue, such as working at heights. That is a specific issue that needs to be funneled into its own separate risk assessment, specifically when looking at Section 10 of our construction regulation with regards to fall protection. When fall protection comes into play, the fall protection plan itself has to have its own working at heights risk assessment. So that's a separate issue or a separate task. But it also has to be site specific. You see, the risk assessment that we may use might be a copy of or paste of the previous task that we did. For instance, you putting in some sort of geyser or perhaps solar panels, and you have to work on a roof, and to access the roof you set up your scaffold, and you're doing the same job on the next site. So what has really changed? The task hasn't changed. The setting up of the scaffold hasn't changed. So you might think, well, you can use the exact same risk assessment. And to a large part, we can use most of what is in that risk assessment. But what other issues may we find on a separate site? Well, we know we say site specific. Well, it means that we need to know the site. We need to know the environment that we are going to be working in. We need to know what the weather conditions will be. Are you going to have the same type of scaffold, or are you going to be changing from aluminium to quick stage scaffolding? Is there a proper access point when you climb onto the roof? Are there anchor points like the previous job to attach your lifeline to? How are you going to lift that geyser or solar panel? Perhaps the previous job allowed for a lot of space, whereas the new job doesn't have that much access. So all of that will come into play. We also need to understand that although each job might be very similar, it is never exactly the same. And so our risk assessment will generally change. But is that really what we are discussing when it comes to monitor and review of our risk assessment? Well, we'll discuss that on the next slide. Let's take a look at the last type of risk assessment you are going to want to monitor and review. And this is a continuous based risk assessment. All of us do it many times throughout the days, weeks, or months in any job. And this is an assessment to check specific things such as excavations, confined space entry, lockout, tagout, or a specific task that you are doing for that day. Now, there's many different names for continuous based risk assessments. We use a DSTI. This is a daily safe task instruction. This is where it's a piece of paper. Before you start working, you outline what are you going to be doing for that day, because it's a daily safe task instruction. You then outline the hazards and the risks and the safe working method of performing that task. And perhaps on the day, something has changed compared to the original risk assessment that we have. And this is a great way for health and safety officers, risk assessors, or even SHE reps to take a look at this document and see perhaps if a risk or a hazard wasn't clearly outlined in the original issue-based risk assessment. Perhaps we need to make changes to our initial or baseline risk assessment. You see, this is a form of monitoring. Each component of our risk management system helps us to monitor the one before. And so if our DSTIs are being done daily and we are checking and monitoring whether additions are being made, a change in the scope of work, a change in the task, perhaps something is different or a new risk or hazard presented itself. Well, that is a brilliant way for us to monitor and then action a review with the change or implementation of a change to take effect. Another type of continuous-based risk assessment is a planned task observation. Now, these are generally done every week, normally by a supervisor or a manager of a site. And a planned task observation is where someone in the form of authority, generally, as we mentioned, it's a manager or a supervisor on a site, will observe a task that is being performed. Now, he cannot make notes or recommendations on that task without first understanding the task or issue-based risk assessment. And so you need to have a good understanding of the risk on your site. You then observe the job, compare it with how the risk assessment tells us we should be doing it, and then make any notes of inconsistencies, non-conformances, or positive things that you have noticed from that. This then helps us again to monitor whether the task is being done either in accordance with the risk assessment, or if the risk assessment needs to be changed or adapted to the task that is being performed. Now, we're not saying that at any given time, when you perform your task, that you are doing it wrong if it's not in line with the risk assessment. We are also not saying that your risk assessment is wrong if it is not in line with the task that you are performing. What we are saying is we want to monitor whether the two are speaking to each other and if it complements one another. If the risk assessment puts step number 2 in place of step number 5, well, then it's pretty simple. Which one is right? Should it be 1, 5, 3, 4, 2? In those steps, is that the correct procedure? Well, then change it on your risk assessment. Are the employees performing the task, but putting in step 4 in step 2, which is incorrect? Well, in that case, just do a little bit of training and perhaps go over the methodology of installing that specific piece of plumbing. So this is really what we are trying to achieve. We are monitoring the work, the processes, the tasks that are being performed in order to ensure the effectiveness of the risk assessment. So we're not saying that a piece of paper on site is going to keep us safe. We're talking about the idea and what really a risk assessment stands for. And that is to ensure we know as the employees and the employer what can hurt us and harm us on site. And then what is the consequence of that? How likely, what is the percentage that we can get hurt? And what are the outlined safe work procedures? How do we do this job? Not only in accordance with your own SANS standard as a plumber, but in accordance with a safety procedure so that you are not hurt or injured while you are on site. So since that is being checked, the question that you ask yourself is, well, when should this be checked? Well, as we mentioned in the outset, something that is monitored means continuous, very much like the service or maintenance on your vehicle. It is something that you periodically check. Now, periodically is open to discussion. How often do you check your vehicle to see whether it's running smoothly? Well, some of you that I've spoken to say, well, you check it every time before you get in. And some say, well, we check it every week. Others say the manufacturer checks it, so it should be fine when I get it back from them. And none of you are wrong, but what would be the guideline? What would be industry standard? Now, there's no law to say that you must do a risk assessment, monitoring and review plan at this specific time. So then how often should we do it? and what should we be looking out for when it comes to our risk assessments, particularly now looking at the past year, new regulations that have come in, new methodologies, and then looking toward the year ahead. Well, as a general rule, all types of risk assessments, when the following happens, we need to perform a review. So these are the 5 areas that we need to look out for, and this should also be part of our risk assessment, monitoring, and review plan. We should then identify, but in our plan, we can be a lot more specific than this. In other words, you need to make a dedicated date and time of when this scheduled review will be. Is it going to be 2 years for your issue and baseline? Will it be annually when you update all your policies and procedures? Is it going to be 6 monthly or 3 monthly on your risk assessments? Well, for each industry, it's different because, as we mentioned, you have industry standard reviews. So let's give you the industry standard for the construction regulation. Now, for many of you plumbers, you are working in accordance with the construction regulations. Some of you are even on sites performing construction works, or perhaps you are working as a plumber, not as a principal contractor or as a main contractor, but you're just a subcontractor on site and you still need to conform to the construction regulations. Well, it mentions there that we need to have a monitor and review plan. It doesn't tell us how often we should monitor and review. So what would be the industry standard for construction regulations? Well, in this case, a baseline or issue-based risk assessment is generally has a scheduled review of every year. So every year we have a scheduled review of our baseline or initial risk assessment. Then, as an industry standard, all our task and issue-based risk assessments are monitored and reviewed, specifically reviewed after 3 months. And so we give it a date. This risk assessment was performed on the 1st of November 2020. 3 months from now, this risk assessment almost expires. In other words, we will reissue a new revision for that task that is being performed. But do we just change the dates? Well, no. We need to look at the next 4 items. We need to see, is there a change in legislation? Has something come out? Has something been promulgated? Let's take, for example, the ergonomics regulations of 2019 that are going to be coming into effect in 2021. I think it's March or April, somewhere around there. And that means that you have to have ergonomics regulations 2019 implemented into your risk assessment. Now, many that we're speaking to say, well, that's a lot of work that we have to put in place. Well, maybe go take a look at Section 9 of the construction regulations. After it mentions monitor and review plan that should be in our risk assessments, it mentions that we must take into consideration ergonomic related hazards. So that was done in 2014 already. So we should automatically be in the mind frame of taking a look at new regulations because it's constantly evolving and changing. And so we need to keep up to date, understand what is new for our industry. Perhaps it could be a change in task, a new type of machine, a new piece of equipment that you're using, or a new tool that you have to use in order to do this task now. So for some of you, you bought the water pack from Cape Town. The water pack is a brilliant idea on saving water when working on your geysers so that you do not have to throw all that water away. You can put it into the water pack, you can fix things onto your geyser, and you can replace the water from the water pack back into the actual geyser. And this is done in record time as well. So perhaps you've bought that type of equipment. But has this changed your risk assessment? You see, the task that you're performing is still the same. You're still draining the geyser and filling the geyser again. You're still performing the individual repairs on that geyser, but you've implemented a new piece of equipment. Now, what are the risks? What are the hazards of working with that piece of equipment? Perhaps there's new tools that have come out because there's different type of plumbing such as new piping that have come out. And now you're not going to be using PVC welding anymore. You're now going to be hot butt welding two pieces of plumbing piping together. So perhaps it's now going to be hot butt welded and no longer PVC welded. Or perhaps on this job, the client is not willing to pay for that expensive type of piping, and you will have to use PVC weld. Well, now you're introducing chemicals into your task. And you see, this is now a change in task. So your risk assessment essentially should change. And this means that you're going to have a new review of your risk assessment. Then what about improvements, new technologies, or new methodology of performing a task or a specific action? See, this is when we would constantly monitor what we are doing with the use of those continuous-based risk assessments, with the use of procurement, with the use of committee meetings where we discuss these items of changes or improvements that are being made, and it should affect our risk assessment. It means we need to review the effectiveness of the risk assessment that we currently have. Lastly, one that gets overlooked very often is incidents and accidents. Now, we want to prevent the reoccurrence of an incident or an accident. But when an incident or an accident happens, regardless of the severity, we should review our risk assessment. Now, you might be saying, well, Chris, this is a lot of time for somebody having a near miss on site, and now we have to review our entire risk assessment. Well, that's not specifically what we're saying. Let us take a look at a base or issue-based risk assessment. You are performing the task of climbing onto a scaffold and installing solar panels onto a roof. The near miss could be that somebody drops a tool when working on the roof. Now, do you have to look at the risk assessment from start, arriving on site? Do you have to look at portable electrical tools? Do you have to look at hazardous chemical substances? Well, not necessarily. You see, the incident that took place was the dropping of a tool off the roof. So the parts of the risk assessment that you're mainly going to look at is obviously the training of the employee, the types of tools that are being used. Do you have to have a tool belt? Do you have to have a lanyard attached to the tool? See, all these items, if it's perhaps not on your risk assessment, you could say, well, the risk assessment did not cover all the risks. Perhaps the risk did cover those hazards, and it has outlined that certain procedures need to be put in place, but the procedures are very vague. Well, then the review would call for more specific safe working procedures. Be more specific to your employees and train them on the understanding of dropping tools or working with tools when working at height. Does your risk assessment cover all of that? And it was just a near miss. It happens. You covered everything. The employee had the lanyard on. It just happened. The tool fell from height. Well, go through your risk assessment again. Double check it. If nothing needs to be changed, at least you checked it. At least you took the effort to see if there's an improvement that can be put in place. Update your review and resubmit your risk assessment with new training. Remember, every time you review a risk assessment, your employees for that task need to be retrained on the risk assessment. And we encourage you not to just ask your employees to sign the risk assessment. Please ensure that you take time to read and understand what the risk assessment says. Remember, it's protecting you from dangers or hazards on a site. Essentially, it's keeping you safe. We don't just want to sign to say we understand. We want to really understand so that we can practice the safe working procedures. Now, as we mentioned, we are discussing the construction regulation when it comes to perhaps the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Under Section 8, it tells us that the employer is responsible for mitigating risks and hazards. Under your general safety regulations, it tells us that he needs to perform a risk assessment, and under general administrative regulations, he needs to keep records of such risk assessments. So all of this works together, and we are not specifically saying that you have to abide by either one of these regulations because it all depends on where you are working. So in the office, Maybe you have an issue-based risk assessment for working on a computer. Maybe your risk assessment outlines the use of electric cables for the equipment that you are using. Maybe these risk assessments need to be reviewed every year. But what we are asking is, do you have a risk assessment, monitor, and review plan? Well, it is outlined in legislation. And as we mentioned, for the construction regulation, under section 9.1 D and E, it states that a contractor, before the commencement of any construction work, must have a risk assessment performed by a competent person in writing, and it must include a monitoring plan and a review plan. Now, if you need assistance with this, perhaps you need help with a type of monitor and review plan, or you just want to know how to implement it, well, get in touch with us. IOPSA is obviously giving you free occupational health and safety consulting. So reach out to us. It's WhatsApp line. You can send us an email to info@ohss.co.za. You can send an email to safety@iopsa.org. Or you can give us a call if we are available. We'll take your call. If we are not, please send us a message so that we can get back to you. We really want to assist you with your risk assessments, especially when it comes to monitoring it, so that the effectiveness of keeping you safe is always there. And then don't forget, we really want to encourage you to invite as many people as possible to join in with these Toolbox Talks. And then also, we encourage you to please reach out to us and tell us what you want to hear. And again, a very big thank you to Rudy for reaching out to us on the carbon monoxide with gas geysers, and we'll definitely be taking a look at that on the 24th of November. So stay tuned. We look forward to seeing you next week again. If you have any questions and comments, we have a few minutes now. Otherwise, we prefer getting back to you on email. Thank you very much.